With less than 2 weeks left in the regular season, there's not only a tie for the third NL Wildcard spot, but all three NL Wildcard spots are currently only within 3.5 games of each other. With so much going on, let's take a look today at each team's remaining schedule and what their records could be like against those teams. Then at the end, we'll put all of this together and I'll make a prediction on which teams I think will make it to the postseason and which team I think will be left out. Let's go ahead and start with the Atlanta Braves, as they are currently tied with the Mets for that final wildcard spot. They have one more game against the Dodgers, and then the Braves head to Cincinnati to play the Reds for the second time this year. And the Braves are currently 0-3 against the Reds in 2024, including an 0-1 loss to them in a recent makeup game on September 9th. Afterwards, the Braves will take on the Marlins, who in 10 games this year they've beaten up on 7 times. Finally, they'll see 3 games against the Mets, and these could be 3 very crucial games for either team. The Braves and Mets have each seen each other a total of 10 times so far this year, and so far they have tied this season series at 5. Finally, the Braves will take on the red-hot, probably postseason-bound Kansas City Royals at home to wrap up the season, who they have not played yet this year. Considering the Braves already took 2 from the Dodgers this series, let's just say for the sake of this video that they don't win the 4th game with them. It looks like the Braves will then need to take 2 out of 3 from the Reds, but really if they can snag 4 out of 6 from between the Reds and the Marlins, they can make this a lot easier on themselves, which I think is absolutely doable. From there, the series with the Mets seems like it's going to be a crucial one, as taking 2 out of 3 there allows them to potentially get ahead of the Mets, and with a series win against the Mets, they would own the tiebreaker. So depending on what the Mets do, they could potentially in that scenario lose 2 games against Kansas City and still take the wild card spot, or even lose all 3 to Kansas City if they sweep the Mets. This is all obviously dependent on what the other teams do, but in my opinion, if any of these teams win around 88 games, depending on tiebreakers, then they will be in the playoffs this year. Now, what anyone thinks each team will do for the rest of the year is obviously up for interpretation, but I'll be giving my reasonings throughout the video and I'll show a few different ways that it could work out for each team, along with my final prediction at the end. But obviously, any team winning out or losing out changes things dramatically. And don't forget, these are just my opinions of what I think it'll look like based on the remaining schedules and head-to-head records this year. So I could be completely wrong, but this is just a fun little video to go over a few of the more likely scenarios in my opinion. So like I said, if you want to see a little more as to how I think the Braves or any of these teams can make the playoffs, or as to why I think somewhere around 88 wins will be enough for any of these teams to make the playoffs, keep watching as I'll talk about the other 3 teams and how that relates to Atlanta. And like I said, at the end I will be giving a summary of this entire race along with my final prediction. Now let's take a look at the Mets' remaining schedule, as they'll be taking on the Nationals for 3 games, and they have handled the Nationals this year, as in 10 games they have won 8. The Mets will then see the first place Philadelphia Phillies come to town for 4 games, and the Mets currently have a 3-5 record with the Phillies this year, so 4 more games with them is not something the Mets are looking forward to. After that, they'll head to Atlanta for the aforementioned series, where again the Mets currently have a season series record of 5-5 with Atlanta. So this series will break that tie one way or another, and it has a chance to have a huge impact on this last wildcard spot. Finally, they'll head to Milwaukee to take on the also first place Brewers, who they've dropped all 3 games to so far this year. In my opinion, the Mets really have to handle the Nationals if they want to have the best shot at this, as they have to face the gauntlet afterwards in the first place Phillies, the playoff-hungry Braves, and the first place Brewers, none of which the Mets currently have a winning record against so far this year. If they can't sweep the Nationals, they'll need to at least win the series against the Braves to have a real shot here. They do have a path without winning the series against the Braves, and Atlanta also has a path without winning the series against the Mets, but to do that, they'll have to start by at least sweeping the Nationals, and then the Braves would need to drop at least 3 from the Reds and the Marlins. At that point, the Mets would then need to at least split in Philly or win the series in Milwaukee. That's one of the wackier, less likely scenarios to me, but in my opinion, taking at least 2 of 3 from the Nationals, 2 out of 3 from the Braves, and winning at least 2 games total from either the Brewers and or the Phillies series seems like a bare minimum to me. In that scenario, if the Braves only take 4 from the Reds and Marlins, and then 1 from the Mets and 1 from the Royals, they would also win 87 games, but the Mets would hold the tiebreaker to Atlanta in that situation. But you could also see how Atlanta could take another game from Kansas City, or the Mets could take another game from the Phillies or the Brewers, so you could play around with this a bit and see how it's up for interpretation. But really, the Mets just need to handle the Nationals, just like the Braves need to handle the Marlins and the Reds. And that series against Atlanta is shaping up to be huge, as it'll decide a possible tiebreaker, and it could be enough for one team to separate themselves from the other. The Mets also hold the season series tiebreaker against Arizona, so winning around 88 games in that final series in Atlanta seems to be the ticket for a guaranteed wild card spot for either the Braves or the Mets. Next, we have the Arizona Diamondbacks, who are 2 games ahead of the Braves and Mets for that second wild card spot. They'll see the Rockies for 3 games, who they are currently 8-2 against on the season. Then they'll head to Milwaukee for 4 games, and then back home to take on the Giants, who they are 6-4 against on the year. Finally, they'll finish out the year with a potentially crucial series against the San Diego Padres, who they are currently tied for on the year at 5-5 with. For the Diamondbacks, it seems like 5 or 6 wins should secure them that wild card berth. The easiest way for them to do that is by taking at least 3 out of 6 from the Rockies and the Giants, as they'll then only need 2 or 3 wins from those other 7 games. If they can't get it done against the Rockies and the Giants, then in my opinion it starts to get murkier for the Diamondbacks, as unfortunately for them, both the Braves and the Mets hold the tiebreaker over them. With the Rangers not making the playoffs this year, it would be kinda odd to see neither team from last year's World Series even making the playoffs this year. Now, that is not looking super likely, but it is still entirely possible at this point. Currently at the top of this wildcard race is the Padres, who will start off by seeing the first place Houston Astros, who they have not seen yet this year. After that, they will see a team that could potentially lose the most games in MLB history in the Chicago White Sox, who have already lost 115 games so far this year. After that should be cakewalk. They'll head to LA to see the first place Dodgers, who they've seen 10 times so far this year and dropped 7 to them so far. Finally, they'll finish up the year in Arizona, and if you're a San Diego fan, you really hope to have clinched by now, as this is another potentially big series, as either or both of these teams could be fighting for their lives at that point. Now, that's not looking very likely at this point, at least for San Diego, but it's baseball. Anything can happen. And in 10 games so far this year, the Padres and the Diamondbacks have tied 5 apiece, so that series will determine the tiebreaker. Considering the Padres are the team that are 3.5 games up, they are in the best position right now. They get to play the potentially worst team in history in the Chicago White Sox, and they also hold the tiebreaker over the Braves and are tied with the Diamondbacks for their tiebreaker. So really, out of the 4 teams, the Padres are in the driver's seat. Like I said before, anything over 88 wins should be enough for any of these teams to get in, and the Padres already have 85 wins, with only 12 games left in the season. And they have 3 games left against the White Sox, so things are looking really good for San Diego. It would take them losing big time over the next 4 series for them to miss the playoffs. So with that, let's go ahead and give our prediction. Starting with the Padres, I won't repeat everything I just said. Let's just go ahead and put them in the first wildcard spot. That leaves us with a much murkier picture between Atlanta, Arizona, and New York. Let's start with Arizona, as they currently have a 2-game lead on the Mets and the Braves. The Diamondbacks do not hold the tiebreaker with either the Braves or the Mets, so they will need to beat out both teams in the records to make it to the playoffs. If they can't take 3 out of 6 from the Rockies and Giants, then things will certainly start to get more interesting. The Diamondbacks may be able to get away with as little as 4 wins, but they will probably need 5 or 6 just to make sure that they don't tie the Braves or the Mets. Which, like I said, for the Diamondbacks, a tie is a loss. Now, the Braves have 6 more games against teams under 500 in the Marlins and the Reds, with the Mets only having 1 series against a losing team in the Nationals. But if the Diamondbacks can't get ahead in those games against the Rockies or the Giants, then they'll have to come up with some more wins against better teams like the Brewers or the Padres. Which they've lost 2 of 3 to the Brewers so far this year and have tied 5-5 with the Padres. So hoping that they can win 3 or more ball games against those 2 teams is Certainly possible, but they'd rather get it done earlier. I actually see the Diamondbacks winning 6 more games this year, putting them in a firm second place with 89 wins. But if they only win 5 or less, they could certainly miss the playoffs. Now it is time for what you guys have all been waiting for. This is the biggest playoff showdown of the year. We have the tied NL East rivals in the Atlanta Braves and the New York Mets, facing off for the third and final wildcard spot. Looking at it, I think either team is going to win around 5 to 7 games the rest of the year. The Braves really need to take 4 out of 6 from Miami and Cincinnati to make it easier on themselves, while the Mets will look to put some pressure on the Braves with a big series against the Nationals. It's shaping up to look like that final series between the Mets and the Braves could be a big one, as not only could one team start to separate themselves, but it will decide who wins the tiebreaker as well. For the Mets, they really need to not only beat, but to sweep the Nationals to make this better for themselves. As if they only take 2 from them, for example, and the Braves, let's say, take 4 or more from the Reds or Marlins, then the Mets will need to take at least 2 from between the Phillies and Brewers, and take 2 of 3 from the Braves to really have a good shot at this. Remember, they can't just take 3 from the Phillies and Brewers and 1 from Atlanta, because a tie would send Atlanta to the playoffs in that situation. Now, you can play around with this a bit, but the Mets really need to sweep the Nationals and or have the Braves drop 3 games to the Reds and or Marlins to really help the Mets out. But let's say the Mets take only 2 from the Nationals, 1 from the Phillies and 1 from the Brewers. That would make that final series with Atlanta a huge one, potentially even a wild card deciding one. But if they sweep the Nationals and take at least 3 from the Phillies and Brewers, then they may be able to secure a playoff spot without even having to win the series against Atlanta. As if Atlanta can only take 3 out of 6 from the Reds and Marlins and 1 from Kansas City, then even if they took 2 from the Mets, it wouldn't be enough to get the tie. Likewise, if the Mets can only take 2 from the Nationals and 1 from Philly and Milwaukee, then that'll make things start to look much more bleak for them, as they'll basically need to sweep the Braves in that scenario. 5 wins, even with winning the tiebreaker against Atlanta, probably doesn't do it. Like I said, that would really require the Braves dropping 3 out of 6 from the Reds and Marlins and only taking 1 from Kansas City. But if the Braves come out swinging and take more than 4 from the Reds and Marlins, things will begin to look much more bleak for the Mets. But there are plenty of variables here, like I said earlier, and if one of these teams just wins out or loses out, then everything changes. But of these 2 teams, I do think that the Braves look to be in the best position, as they will play more games against teams that are under 500. But regardless, it is looking like the winner of the series between the Mets and the Braves could be the winner of that final wildcard spot. So to wrap it all up, I think San Diego will take that first wildcard spot, followed by the Diamondbacks, and then finally, I do believe that final wildcard spot will be decided in that final series in Atlanta, which I ultimately do believe will go to Atlanta, making them the third and final wildcard spot. But regardless of what happens, this should be an exciting last few weeks of baseball to watch, and don't forget, anything can happen. Any of these teams winning out or losing out makes this potentially more or less fun, but hopefully we'll have some high-intensity baseball to watch for the next few weeks regardless. But anyways, that'll do it for this one. Be sure to comment down below as to what you think will happen or what your favorite team is, and make sure to subscribe as it really helps this channel grow. And as always, I hope you all have a wonderful day.